Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this session. Very well welcome to this session, which is the last of 3 pre-launch events of the DSA Conference 2022, entitled Just Sustainable Futures in an Urbanizing and Mobile World. The last 2 events covered are now available on the DSA website, and I really warmly invite you to listen to them in your own time. The conference itself will be running online from 6th to 8th of July and is being hosted by the Development Studies Association and University College London, UCL. So there's still time to register, so please do join if you're able. We will show the slide for registration right at the end of the event. I would like to acknowledge here the support of UCL's Grand Challenges and Global Engagement for supporting the pre-conference webinars, and also the Bartlett faculty for its funding support to the conference, in particular in ensuring the participation from Global South colleagues. So my name is Barbara Lipietz. I work at the Bartlett's Development Planning Unit at UCL. I'm also Vice Dean International of the Bartlett faculty. I will be chairing this exciting and reflexive panel, exploring the role of the university in bringing about just sustainable futures. Before getting stuck in, I'd like to briefly touch on housekeeping considerations. So this session is recorded and will go onto the DSA conference website shortly after the event. Attendees will not be visible. Also, I'd like to encourage feedback and impressions from our audience today. So please feel free to use the chat function. And I'd also especially like to encourage questions for our panelists. So could you please use the Q&A function button for this, which is at the bottom of your screen. So why this panel on the role of the university in bringing about just sustainable futures? Of course, the DSA conference provides a perfect backdrop for this. So it's an academic conference seeking to explore and respond to our contemporary challenging world. So in the word of the conference itself, it's exploring just futures in an urbanizing and mobile world, facing a climate and ecological crisis, also in a pandemic or post-pandemic context. So the multiple crises that are engulfing our global community are multiple, intersecting, and require nuanced, place-specific responses that are steeped in an understanding of the longue durée of structural processes, an understanding of the stubbornness of entrenched power relations at multiple scales, and the impact also of accelerating global processes such as climate change, biodiversity loss, or the growth of the digital revolution. Deep inequalities puncture societies and communities' abilities to engage with, adapt, and change their given environment for the better. And in this fast changing context, the role of knowledge production and learning are critical, but is also hotly contested. Historically, academia has had a privileged position in this knowledge space, and part of that privilege or that legitimacy has been its perceived publicness, the perceived publicness of the university. So producing knowledge for the public good, training future practitioners, but also future knowledgeable citizens. But this vision of the university as a public actor, or this public role of the universities, has come under challenge from without the university, with critiques of an aloofness from the urgent and conflictual reality, so that famous image of the university as an ivory tower, and from within also, with many colleagues questioning the impact of market intrusion into the university and what it may mean for the university's ability to play its public role. So how then can we rethink or reactivate the public role of the university so that it can indeed play a role in supporting more just, sustainable futures? How does this public role manifest in different contexts? How does it articulate across the 3 key functions of the university, namely education, research, and public engagement? And as we think about these challenges, what are levers of change? What can support a more engaged, just, and ethical practice of knowledge production and co-learning? Finally, I'd like to draw attention to the local global dynamic at the core of the questions I've just set out, or the core of this reflection. What key questions does international engagement, or an international ecosystem, as one of our speakers calls it, raise for thinking about, for activating a public role of the university? These are really big questions for our panel, and I don't think we'll be able to address all the array of issues here, but we have 4 wonderful speakers coming from very diverse contexts. And as you will see just now, they have a lot to say about these issues, and I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation. So we have 4 speakers, and I'm going to present them in turn. The first speaker for now is Neha Sami. Neha is Associate Dean at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. Her research focuses on the governance of infrastructure, especially mega infrastructure, in the context of post-liberalization urban India, as well as environmental governance, particularly in the subnational scale, where she focuses on institutional analysis and state capacity. She teaches on questions of governance and sustainability and anchors the research program at the IIHS. So her research has been published in a number of journals: Economic and Political Weekly, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Land Use Policy. And she also is a corresponding editor for the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. She's also on the editorial collective of Urbanization. I won't go in the detail of her credentials, but there are many, as you will see just now. Neha, looking forward to hearing your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. It is indeed just a privilege to be here. And it's also, I think, really wonderful to sort of participate in this as part of a longer conversation that we have been having with colleagues at the DPU and elsewhere as well. So as Barbara mentioned, I'm located at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore. And what I would like to reflect on today is sort of my experiences and sort of drawing on experiences of my colleagues at the IIHS on the role of an institution like the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in the larger kind of role of learning, knowledge production, and dissemination. In doing so, I want to focus on 3 key things. One, in our context, is particularly the institutional form that we have chosen as an institution. So the sort of approach that we have selected, and the approach that we have kind of after much deliberation arrived at around our sort of teaching and learning pedagogy and philosophy. And as Barbara mentioned earlier, the role that we have played and the way we see ourselves as part of a larger ecosystem of knowledge production. So the IIHS is relatively young. We're just over 10 years old. And we were set up actually with the explicit aim of performing a very particular sort of public-facing function in the Indian context, which was to create a new generation of urban practitioners. And so the kind of the role of a university as a public space and as a performing a very key kind of role within not just the educational ecosystem, but also within policy and practice is something that is kind of built into the DNA of the IIHS. And so in that way, we're a little bit different from other universities. Because we're also, and this is where really our institutional form, I think, has stood us in good stead, is that we aren't actually a university yet. We're an aspiring university. We are a national education institution, but we have also been able to experiment and function in multiple ways and perform certain roles within the Indian education system because we have been outside of the formal public university system as well. And I think that is something that I want to highlight, is the role of a public university, a private university, or something like IIHS that sits between and straddles between those two. And it has been because of our kind of fluidness of being able to move between being an educational institution, but also being able to practice and intervene in policy, intervene in place in India very concretely, that has emerged from the sort of flexibility that our institutional form has given us. And that is something that I would like to put on the table as sort of thinking about the institutional form of the university and the shape that it needs to take in order to be flexible, to respond to a whole range of questions, a whole range of challenges, whether in terms of the kind of knowledge it produces and the kind of knowledge it disseminates, but also the function that it performs in, and the ability of it to bring people together to create that knowledge. And that to me brings me to my second point, which is sort of the larger approach that the IIHS has taken in terms of thinking through how we would like to teach and how we would like to create and disseminate knowledge. And the IIHS curriculum was actually co-created over a long 2-year process, which several people on this call, on this panel, including colleagues at the DPU, were part of. And it was sort of created in collaboration with colleagues across the South, across the North, to actually reevaluate and reconfigure in some ways what an urban pedagogy for emerging sort of 21st century urban regions needs to be. And the outcome of it, at least in our context and the way we operationalize it and we practice it, is that we try very hard to redefine what the classroom itself means. We've tried very hard to expand and sort of reconfigure the idea of what a classroom is, to actually bring the city and a whole range of other participants who might not be considered as conventional pedagogues, including community stakeholders, activists, government officials, into the classroom, but also take the classroom to them. And one example of it is workshops that we run regularly as part of the recently concluded No project with colleagues at the DPU on teaching and learning for community stakeholders and activists across India. And the foundation of what we've tried to do at IIHS in terms of our role as a knowledge institution is actually to also be a convener, to provide a space not just for academics and not just for researchers, but for urbanists in general, and however they define themselves, to come together, to be able to share knowledge, and to be able to participate in the process of creating knowledge itself. And in doing so, we try to not privilege particular sort of histories of learning. And we try kind of to bring together a larger group of people, including actually our learners in the classroom. And so our teaching philosophy relies very much on everybody in the classroom, however, the classroom is defined, whether it is within the 4 walls of the university or outside in the city, to all collectively learn together. And I think that is something that universities have the power to do, to bring together and to convene around sort of, and be able to sort of open up to different kinds of knowledges, to be able to not privilege a certain set of voices over others. And finally, I think I'd like to sort of close by talking about sort of this participation in a larger ecosystem of knowledge creation, production, and dissemination. And I think coming from an institution that is embedded in the South, coming from an institution that actually within the Indian context, where there isn't a very robust research ecosystem, for example, or there isn't a very robust funding ecosystem, it has been a privilege for us at IIHS to be able to participate in sort of international ecosystems of learning, of funding, and that has allowed us and given us the freedom and flexibility to be able to convene locally. It has allowed us the ability to convene across, not just in India, but across different locations of the global South. And that to me has been an incredible privilege. And I think that is something else that I feel universities, and in our context particularly, has both been and it has given us the freedom to act and design kind of, processes and structures that enable us to collaborate across local, regional, and international boundaries, but has also been a really sort of strong constraint for us. And it leaves us as an institution in a very precarious situation, because in the absence of being able to participate in a larger sort of political economy around knowledge, in the absence of, for example, funding, the kind of ability of an institution like ours, which is young, which is located in in the South, becomes quite challenging and quite tricky. And so I think that that going forward, it would be great if we as universities, as people participating in knowledge ecosystems, were able to find ways of leveraging partnerships and using sort of this international dimension and the kind of participating in the larger international ecosystem to actually leverage much more partnerships across the South and sort of foster that kind of learning across institutions, so that there is kind of a flexibility, a flow of knowledge and partnerships and communication across these different forms and functions. Because as at IIHS, we've learned a lot from being part of these, and I think that it has, while that has brought a lot to us in terms of what we've been able to do, the constraints have been really, really challenging, and I think it's worth thinking about how we can kind of collectively, as university spaces, as knowledge institutions, transcend some of those. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Neha, for these really great comments to kick the conversation. Lots of very interesting insights here on the institutional form, as you mentioned, and the kind of the way in which, in a way, the fuzziness that IIHS has enabled you to do very interesting things in this public role. Also very interesting questions regarding urban pedagogy. I'm sure we'll be coming back to that. And also, I really appreciate your reflection here on this wider knowledge and learning ecosystem and the international dimensions of that. You mentioned some of the challenges. I'm sure we'll come back to that and see how we can think about that collectively. So we're going to pass now to our second speaker, but can I please encourage you to start sending questions in the Q&A. After we've heard from our four speakers, we'll open up to the floor, and no doubt there will be, I know there is dialogue between all of them, but please start sending your questions already. That's fantastic. So now we are going to be hearing from our colleague Mona Harb. Mona is Professor of Urban Studies and Politics at the American University of Beirut, where she is co-founder and research lead at the Beirut Urban Lab. Her research investigates governance and territoriality in context of contested sovereignty, urban activism, and oppositional politics, and spatial practices in fragmented cities. She's the author of Le Hezbollah à Beyrouth, de la banlieue à la ville, co-author of Leisurely Islam, Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shihai, South Beirut with Lara Dib, co-editor of Local Governments and Public Goods, Assessing Decentralization in the Arab World with Sami Attallah, and co-editor of Refugees as City Makers with Mona Fawaz et al. She serves on the editorial board of MELG, these are all acronyms, which I'm not going to be giving now, but a number of journals. So Mona, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few points on context, because I believe the public role of the university also varies according to specificities of context. So I'm speaking from the context of Lebanon, which I'd like to highlight. I want to highlight three main points about that context I'm speaking from. First, the context of operating in a quite dysfunctional state, where there are no public institutions that provide public services, including public education to people. A context of post-colonialism and fraught geopolitics. We have a very heavy legacy of political history that still weighs on public life and public affairs today, and a very fraught geopolitical context that makes wars, conflicts, tensions, violence, and displacement, I would say, a feature of everyday life for many, for all residents and dwellers of the country. The third point is that despite, or maybe because of all these challenges, people in Lebanon are in general quite engaged in processes of political mobilization and social mobilization, not necessarily towards change, but they are quite part of public life, public engagement from wherever they are in various ways. I don't have time to dwell on that, but this is a vibrant political society, I would say. Now moving more towards what we're invited to reflect on today, the university. So we do have a public university in Lebanon, but like other public institutions, this has been, the role of the public university has been hijacked by the sectarian political elite that rules Lebanon. And it's not really an active player when it comes to public issues and rights. We also have a plethora of private universities, many of which are actually sort of business ventures that serve the interests of this sectarian elite and their networks. But interestingly, we also have long-standing institutions, educational institutions like the one I come from, which is the American University of Beirut, which play an important role in the public life of the country, specifically the American University of Beirut. And that's, I would say, the main argument I want to make today, that this is a university that stands out as a private non-profit university in this context I just briefed you on, that claims a public role in advancing just and sustainable futures. And it's interesting to note that the motto of AUB, which was declared in 1866, so even before the birth of the Lebanese state, it was actually, the university was named at the time the Syrian Protestant College because Lebanon was part of Syria. The motto of AUB is that they may have life and have it more abundantly. So a very clear slogan towards bringing about just futures, abundant futures, sustainable futures, like we're constantly reminded by the administration. So what I'd like to speak of today is that to show that this public role of the university it's translated in I would say two dimensions. First, there's an institutional context that is brought forth by the university. And AUB is an interesting case because it has been providing a range, I would say, of regulatory, administrative, and financial modalities that foster very much its public role. And it's doing that across the fields of teaching, research, and service, which are the three main domains through which academics and academia operate. And I want to say a few words on the Beirut Urban Lab, which I co-founded with colleagues in 2018 at AUB, as an example of an initiative that came to the fore pretty much because and thanks to that context that facilitates the establishment of such a place, a site. So AUB as an institution has been investing in its public role quite significantly. And I think there's a moment in 2006 where we see that very prominently with the establishment of at least two initiatives that attest to this role. And these are initiatives that have been established by the administration One is the Center for Civic Engagement and Community Service, and the other is the Neighborhood Initiative, which services the neighborhood where AUB operates. And this builds on a public role of the university that existed. AUB also has a farm in the Bekaa region, an agricultural region of Lebanon, through which it also operates a lot of outreach services to the vulnerable communities in this region, and through various training and workshop programs. So I see these three initiatives that are very much funded and supported and regulated by the administration as a very clear signal, not only to the public audience outside of the walls of the university, but also to the faculty and students within AUB, that this is a new university that wants to foster and promote and claim its public role and as a central component of its mission. In addition to that, if we take a look at, the teaching mission and the teaching practice of the university, what the university, what the university supports and advocates in its teaching mission, we see that there's a lot of celebration of a classroom that's very porous, very permeable to guest lecturers, to policy interventions, to workshops, to studio-like teaching, to engagement with the industry and the private sector and NGOs and civil society organization that encourages a classroom that is quite professional in that sense. We see that at the level of research, also the university revises its guidelines in a way to value scholarship of practice, its promotion and tenure guidelines, and encourages its faculty to be reflective practitioners, research activists, policy advocates, even politicians. It facilitated the setup itself of teaching buyouts, paid and unpaid leaves, and it even provides a day a week for faculty members to engage in consulting and other activities, including political organizing if they want to do that, and to bring that back in the classroom. And at the level of service, AUB is very adamant on recognizing service to the profession and to celebrating that in their renewal of contracts and their reviews of files of faculty. Now, just before moving on to the Beirut Urban Lab, quickly, I just want to say a few things about the fact that it's also important to acknowledge that there's an international dimension to this role, and that helps it. Helps its making this public role possible, which is the funding sources that the university has access to. We're talking about an American university, so it does receive a lot of funds from American institutions, government institutions in the US, but also elsewhere, international organizations that want to foster its liberal arts mission. And, I'm not being naive about it. There's also a very strong sense of investment in AUB as a liberal arts university in the context of the geopolitical struggles I mentioned briefly earlier. So just like the French government invests in Christian universities, Americans invest in the AUB university, and this is also part of that, this geopolitical quagmire that Lebanon is part of. So it's important also to highlight that. I still think that this, faculty members and students are quite aware of this situation. They're not at all naive about it, but I still think that this is seen as an opportunity that provides both faculty and students an important possibility to leverage this funding and invest it in their own research, teaching, and service agendas. I think this is largely what we did at the Beirut Urban Lab, which was established in 2018 with colleagues Huwaida Al-Harithi, Mona Fawaz, and Ahmed Gharbiye. So the lab is a research space. We produce scholarship on urbanization, and we document ongoing transformation processes in Lebanon. But we also very much, like Neha was saying, we're very conscious that we're part of an ecosystem that is seeking to advance urban and political change. We are part of it. at least 2 people among us are activists and researchers and contribute a lot to political activist campaigns and initiatives, even prior to the establishment of the lab. And this is how we've been working together, and we established the lab very much as part of this collaborative work. So we are part of this ecosystem of change. We want to empower it by critical inquiry and engage research. We want to organize it in connection to individuals and collective who also aspire to advance just, inclusive, and livable and viable cities. And we've been pretty much part of this ecosystem, namely through the Beirut Medina municipal campaign in 2016, but other campaigns and initiatives to protect the public coast of the city, to prevent the construction of a tourist resort on this coast, to advocate for the opening of public gardens and open spaces, to advance perceptions of refugees that are more inclusive and just, to advocate for more inclusive governance processes, etc., etc. So I think we have identified through the lab probably 2 levers for change that we've been pursuing to strengthen this public role of the university and our role as activist researchers. So one would be this production of evidence-based knowledge that informs policy making, and through which we lobby for inclusive and just and sustainable urban policies. So and this is very much in sync with what's happening in Lebanon. So when the Israeli war on Lebanon happened in 2006, we do action research to inform the reconstruction process. When the housing market bubble is at its peak, we document the processes of financialization in the city, and we produced a platform in open access to give more informed knowledge to activists who are fighting against it. When Syrian refugees started being displaced in Lebanon, we did a research that clarifies that roles to city making against the stigmatizing discourse against them. When the pandemic happened, we did research on its governance and highlighted both sectarian and solidarity tensions that were at play. When the port blast happened in 2020, since the port blast happened, we have been very involved in policy advocacy for integrated and inclusive urban recovery, and we do that with international organizations, public institutions, the municipality, fellow colleagues in NGOs and CSOs. And in many ways, what we're trying to do through this production of knowledge is to create what actually Gramsci calls a war of position. So we're trying to strengthen an alternative position to the hegemonic position, the mainstream position of the sectarian political system, and try to forge alternative institution and an alternative intellectual resource that would allow people to see the world in a different way and to imagine a different political, urban, and social reality. So the Beirut Urban Lab in many ways is, I would say, is trying to nurture this war of position. We're very conscious that we need to do that, and maybe our role is no more than that, only restricted to play that role of contributing to the production of non-sectarian institutions and resources that would shape these alternative narratives, imaginaries, and practices. The second lever of change, I think that is interesting to mention here, and I'll end with that, is that we have been thinking a lot of how to rebuild the public, and I'm putting it in quotation marks, in a context where we don't have representative, effective, and accountable public institutions that protect this public. So how can we do that, and how can the university play this role, which is even more crucial in this context? And we've been experimenting largely with identifying what we're calling institutional ingredients through which we could support the rebuilding of the capacity of public institutions. For instance, we are now very engaged in the platform created by the World Bank, the EU, and the UN in the aftermath of the port blast that's called the 3RF, the Recovery, Reform, and Reconstruction framework, and we have been lobbying with NGOs and syndicates and CSOs to create a planning unit within the municipality of Beirut that would implement an integrated urban strategy for the city. Currently, the municipality is hijacked by sectarian interests. So through this lobbying, we're hoping that we would break that sectarian hegemony in a key institution for the city. I mean, this has been in the works for the past 2 years. It involves a lot of struggle and a lot of pushing and pulling, and I can't say that it's going to lead to somewhere positive, but it's a struggle, and we are pushing for it with our own sets of values I've highlighted. So in sum, I think the Lebanese case shows an interesting positioning of the university as an institution that embraces and claims its public function as a private university, and that's interesting to note, in addition to a strong engagement of faculty members as activist researchers, which seems to provide, in this case, 2 sets of conditions that have helped foster to activate a public role for the university. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Mona, thank you so much for such a rich description of your work. And I think so interesting and intriguing to think in a way, it's almost like an oxymoron, right? A private university activating such a strong public role. And I think you give us some very useful and interesting ways in which you're defining that public role in terms of this notion of creating an evidence for advocacy work in a way, and then creating that public within an ecosystem of change. I think lots of questions to ask here and to unpack. Also very inspiring for many of us is the institutional support for this kind of role, which is quite rare and quite unique. And I'm sure many in the audience, and we've already started quizzing you before that, trying to understand how that came about, because that is often a break actually for many people for many academics in engaging in this public role. So many questions and food for thought now. We're going to pass now to Franciso. Franciso de Assis Comarú Francisco is associate professor at the Federal University of ABC in São Paulo, Brazil, where he leads the Territorial Justice Laboratory, LabLuta, with a master's in urban engineering, a PhD in public health at University of São Paulo, and a postdoc at the Bartles DPU, I have to say, and of course, ILO in Geneva. Francisco has academic and professional experience, consultancy to social movements, urban and environmental planning, and management and housing policies. His research, teaching, and public engagement activities focus on urban policies, central metropolitan areas, public health, popular and environmental education, territorial public policies, and decent work. So Francisco, to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. I'm very happy being here. And I would ask to Winnie, please, if you could. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you see the slides? It's okay? Okay. Thank you. So we could go on, please. Winnie, thank you very much. So as you can see, Brazil, you know, is a very large country. We have thousands of higher education institutions, but the majority of them are private institutions. And we have almost 16% of students in public universities, in public institutions. But at the same time, the public universities are responsible for almost 95% of scientific production in Brazil. So it's very important to have this in mind. The Federal University of ABC is not so large as at the University of São Paulo, for instance, but we have 14 graduate students, almost 4,000 postgraduate students, 800 professors. So we could see we are a medium university in Brazil. The universities in Brazil are linked with the tripods of teaching, research, and extension. And in the teaching, we have at the Federal University many public policies for inclusion for people with disabilities, indigenous people, self-declared Black people, transgender people, refugees. And so it's a kind of inclusive policy in terms of the university. We are strong in terms of research. We've developed many networks and many research, also under the internationalization context. And please, we need to go on if possible. And we have also an important role in terms of extension. And this is my main entry point at the university. We try to develop many programs, projects, and also events and courses of extensions. Please, Winnie. Okay, thank you very much. At our lab, Territorial Justice Lab, we are looking to the injustice and the social injustice that are distributed in the territories, and how we could comprehend and act using extension, popular education, community-based participatory research, and action research as methods. Please, Winnie, thank you. If it's possible, okay. I will just as examples, I will show two currently initiatives. One of them is Observatory of Evictions. We have been developing this project in the last 10 years in a partnership with USP, School of Architecture of USP, and support of our foundation. And in the last 2 years and a half, we took part in the Zero Evictions campaign under the pandemic that could join many social movements. And after I will talk about the COPOLIS. Okay, you can go on. The Observatory of Evictions in Brazil is in a context with many evictions that are developed by the public and private actors. The university is one of the actors that took part in a very large network, but is a kind of different actor. We are not linked inside the territory as public university. We have another roles. These are some images that we developed under the project, trying to understand in terms of urban modeling, trying to modeling what was happening with the families that were evicted in the inner city. So we can go on. We tried to use some tools, developing some tools with journalists, with architects, engineers, and so the context is not good, is not easy. We had many families displaced and treated in the last years in São Paulo city. And please go on. And we have also participated in helped organizing public audiences and public meetings with people, with families. And we tried also to advocate, to create lobbying and advocate with candidates, with technicians, and people that are inside the governance systems. Okay, thank you very much. You can go. And the campaign, the Despejo Zero, Zero Evictions campaign is another initiative that is very linked with the Observatory of Evictions. We took part as well. It's under a context, a very violent context, under the low-income people in Brazil, the homeless people. Okay, you can go on. It's just to show you some pictures and some images. These numbers are not real. The reality is worse than this. But we have an increase, a very important increase of evictions also under the pandemic. And people in the social movements think that the participation of NGOs, universities, and collectives were very, very important to reinforce these networks. Okay, we can go on, and we could act also in the media and in the courts. We reached some decisions in the Supreme Court in Brazil, which was very important, that could generate some important results for the low-income people. Okay, we can go on. Just to show this, some examples, please, Winnie. And here we have a picture with sorry, if you could return, Winnie. I don't know if it's possible. In the last one, please. This the picture show one student of us. This one, thank you very much. Which is Gito. Gito is one of the leaders of homeless movements, and he is a candidate of PhD. He's a student in our university. He's a Black African Brazilian descendant, and he is a very important popular lawyer and also researcher. And he is very much engaged in the public scene in Brazil. He helps very much us inside the university, trying to join in these realities. So I would like just to tell you, this is a very important initiative for us to try to approximate the university to the communities and try to open the university for the public leaders and so on. Please, Winnie, if you could go ahead. I would just show another. You can go, please, Winnie. Thank you very much. You can go ahead with for the next. Yeah, I would show just the other example with which it took part in Gaivota's occupation in the south region of São Paulo city. It's a very different project. It's another example. We helped the community in the diagnosis of the environmental, urban, housing, and social situation. It's in the outskirts of the São Paulo city, close to the reservoir buildings. And we tried to help them in terms of land regularization. And so this project we made in collaboration with Michigan University, the Taubman College. It was very important for us to have this collaboration. And we engaged many students with the studies in the field, trying to understand the reality, and also trying to develop tools. And we can go on, please, Winnie. And also trying to develop a community planning participatory process. We tried to develop. We developed many activities with the community, and also we engaged. We are involved in the engagement of many other communities at this very large region. Okay, we can go. And so, in terms of reflections, these are not affirmative, but this would be like a questions, like issues. If we think that the public university should or could act and participate in councils, audiences, committees. In Brazil, the public university normally took part in this, but not all the universities. And for private, it is a little bit complicated. And also developing pilot projects for social community and environment interests, providing technical assistance to low-income population, vulnerable groups, and communities. This is limited, but we can do as well. also in a very broader, in a more broader role, it contributed to resistance and the defense of science, life, dignity, ecology, human rights, for instance, under this context, which is very difficult in Brazil. As a university as a supra-local political articulator to get out of the territorial control. So we are in a different position. We have militia, we have gangs, we have lots of violence in the outskirts of Brazilian cities, and so the university is privileged if you compare with the local actors. And extension experiences also could have an important potential to help universities to improve their courses and pedagogical itineraries. So that's all. Thank you very much. And I'm here, I can debate with you. Thank you so.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Again, a fantastically rich presentation and very useful data at the beginning on the where knowledge is produced and how much is public in terms of public institution versus other knowledge institutions. So that's very interesting to put things in perspective. I see a lot of parallels also with this question of bringing the university into the city and the city into the universities, which both the IIHS and the experience of Mona in the Urban Lab have been exploring in different ways. And then thank you very much also for raising all these various roles, and again helps us to think about what that public role might be. And I think very useful because clearly there might be debates as to what are the limits of the university's role or public role. So thanks very much for that. We now have our last speaker, Zarina Patel. Zarina is Associate Professor of Human Geography at the University of Cape Town. Her research addresses the politics and practices of achieving just and sustainable urban transitions, focusing on transdisciplinary approaches to navigate alternate insights and responses to complex urban issues in Southern contexts. Her publications on sustainable urban transitions and urban knowledge include joint authorship collaborations with knowledge brokers beyond the academy, which is very important for our discussion, foregrounding the diversity of knowledges that are recognized as authoritative in these debates. She's also, interestingly for this conversation, the principal investigator of the project, the New African Urban University, funded by the Worldwide Universities Network Research Development Fund. By engaging partners with the global North and South, this project aims to set the agenda for a more global and inclusive understanding of the scope of system changes required by universities in Africa to advance SDG 11. Zarina is also editor of Environment Planning and the former editor-in-chief of Urban Forum. She serves on the editorial boards of Local Environment and Urban Sustainability. Thank you very much, Zarina.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the audience for some of your comments already. I'm glad to see that there are some participants that are from Africa as well in the audience. So thank you for this opportunity to share some of my ideas on the role of universities in bringing about just and sustainable futures. I've learned so much. The benefit of being the last speaker is that I've learned so much from the speakers before this. We met last week online, but this has been such a rich and engaging conversation, and I really look forward to many more conversations. There's so many parallels and divergences as well between our different contexts. So just to begin with, I think just to reflect that I've been in and out of university spaces for well over 30 years now. But as Barbara described, my research on urban transitions in African cities, one would imagine that universities are a really good place from which to do this kind of work. However, what I've experienced over the last 30 years in engaging these kinds of questions is that actually universities provide both opportunities and leveraging points, but also huge constraints to working in ways that are working across disciplines, working beyond the university, and working with partners, very diverse kinds of partners. And it's some of these kinds of experiences that I'm wanting to share with you today based on some of the research that I've been doing. So as in the past 5 years or so, I've decided to kind of engage this discomfort I feel within universities for the kind of work that I'm trying to do in terms of looking at just and sustainable urban transitions, to actually using the university as a research site. Like, so what are the kinds of questions we need to ask about making universities more fit for purpose around addressing these kinds of urban issues? And Barbara's introduced the project that I lead currently, the New African Urban University. I'm also going to draw in my discussion on another project that I've been involved in called LIRA 2030, Leading Integrated Research for Agenda 2030, which was a project that was led by the International Science Council with funding from CEDA, and it engaged early career African scholars in urban projects using transdisciplinary methods. So drawing on some of their experiences as well in some of my reflections. So there are three things that I want to focus on in the few minutes that I have. And first is to draw a picture around context and the role of African universities specifically in urban change, and drawing out what are some of the distinctive features of African urban processes and African universities to bring a different dimension into this discussion. I then want to talk a little bit about the kinds of gaps and questions that we are raising in the New African Urban Universities project. And then lastly, I want to hone in, based on the LIRA work that I've been involved in, on the ways in which new forms of urban scholarship challenge the form and function of universities, whilst providing insights into the kinds of structural changes that are required to rise to the challenge of universities playing a central role in looking at questions of just and sustainable futures. So to start with, looking at the role of African universities in fostering sustainability and sustainable and just futures. So academics at African universities have had a long history of influencing urban change. Governance and knowledge lacuna, together with uncompetitive salary structures in higher education, have resulted in academics playing an important role in shaping public policy. However, more recently, there's been an upsurge of focus on the third mission of universities and their role in social engagement, service, public engagement, extension. There's a range of different lexicon to talk about this public role, envisioning and shaping of societal benefits. These influences can be traced back to the global level, as well as to universities who are rapidly adopting the rhetoric and strategic intent of engaging in bidirectional knowledge co-production with a range of actors to foster societal benefits. At UCT, the University of Cape Town, where I am based, social responsiveness is the core pillar of the strategic vision of the university, which is quite similar to the University of Beirut that Mona spoke about. However, despite this strategic intent, support for and recognition of engaged forms of scholarship and teaching are uneven across the university. Given the distinctiveness of urban processes and dynamics in Africa, intervening in urban change must necessarily involve engaging with both theory and with practice. It follows, therefore, that the three main functions of universities, research, teaching, and engagement, must be different on the African continent because of these unique contexts. At UCT, the history of apartheid in South Africa has resulted in a specific focus on social justice, transformation, and decolonization. Transformation interventions are largely focused on shifting the racial representation in employment and admission processes. However, universities have also been the sites of student protest and student-led social movements around, which is quite similar to the Brazilian context that Franciso spoke about, around questions of decolonization. If you think about the Roads Must Fall movement, social and environmental justice issues, including questions around climate change. Despite national and local differences in the histories and trajectories of African universities, they are still largely shaped by the norms of the global north. So that's this glocal embeddedness of African universities. The power dynamics underpinning the theory and practice of urban transitions, transdisciplinary processes, and curriculum development are still assumed to be universalized in contemporary debates. So if we turn our attention to the new African Urban University project that I'm leading, the overarching proposition here is that harnessing the potential of African cities to shape the global environment and development trajectories over the next decade, this really hinges on amplifying and supporting the concept of a reconfigured, a reimagined, or I think in Mona's words, a war of positions. So how do we reposition the African university to engage with the visioning and shaping of local and societal benefits? The increased strategic intent to support engaged scholarship in universities has the potential to foster closer alignment between research, curriculum development, and processes of urban change. Universities themselves need to undergo systematic change, not just at the level of rhetoric, if they're to remain relevant in shaping the urban agenda across the continent. So by engaging with the promise and potential of universities supporting just and sustainable urban futures in Africa, the new African Urban University project focuses on setting a research agenda that engages with making universities fit for purpose by focusing on the intersections between urban research, urban knowledge, and urban competencies. So we identify 3 gaps in advancing this imperative. The first gap is that of understanding the effectiveness and impact of universities in shaping urban change in African cities. The key overriding question is around how universities are leveraging their role in urban change. So as I've said already, whilst academics have had a long-standing role in informing and shaping urban change in African cities, little is documented about how African universities are leveraging their roles in sustainable urban change. Strategic planning interventions in post-colonial and post-apartheid cities have been largely driven by knowledge and expertise from urbanists and planners based at universities who respond as consultants to calls for capacity strengthening across subnational and national governments. Similarly, academics have supported non-government organizations, NGOs, and community outreach structures in devising alternate solutions to municipal service delivery. However, little is known about the spread of interventions being addressed through urban research, what gaps might exist both sectorally and geographically. Networks of African urban researchers have provided evidence that there are a range of strategies and interventions that are being introduced. However, this is being done unevenly at different universities with varying levels of effectiveness. The second gap that we're trying to engage is to understand how time and funding bound transdisciplinary urban projects can have long-term impact, can have a long-term impact, and how we can upscale these. And the key question here is, what role does knowledge co-production play in urban transformation in varying African contexts? As the significance of urban Africa for global environment and development systems becomes clearer, the number of funding programs to support transdisciplinary and engaged research on and in African cities is increasing. These interventions are a significant opportunity for challenging colonial and imperialist histories of infrastructure domination. While there are a growing number of research projects engaging across and beyond universities and across African cities, the challenge of ensuring long-term impact beyond project cycles is a perennial threat. Given the momentum that is gathering around transdisciplinary research and engagement, our understanding of the range of partnerships and knowledge co-production engagements is actually quite limited. Similarly, identifying opportunities to leverage the role of time and funding bound projects in delivering impact and fostering long-term change is also limited. While project timelines are a more obvious and tangible variable, we have a limited understanding of what impact means or could mean in African cities, where questions of relevance, justice, and who benefits are highly contested. Identifying points of leverage for understanding of what impact means or could mean in African cities. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought because I'm looking at the chat as well. Identifying points of leverage for universities to support upscaling and maximizing impact based on local experimentation is critical for building the credibility of transdisciplinary and engaged research. It's also critical to ascertain the nodes of intersection that can bring together different actors and expand the range of collaborations between university researchers policymakers, and societal actors in driving sustainable urban development. Engaging with the implications for knowledge production of funding models that typically position global North universities as leads in research projects, partnering with African universities, is a further area for critical activism. The third gap that we are investigating is understanding the role of curriculum and pedagogy in developing skills to support urban change. The key question here is what and how do we currently teach about African cities, and how does this relate to sustainable cities and engagement and transdisciplinary engaged agendas? Developing the skills and competencies of the next generation of scholars and urban influencers is a central imperative of universities. The data and knowledge requirements of the SDGs provide an opening for the kinds of methodological and analytical skills that students require. However, the distinctiveness of theory and practice shaping urban transitions in African cities underscores the need to decolonize the curriculum in ways that reflect contextual relevance and challenge universalized assumptions. Curriculum and new pedagogic modes are required to change the landscape of practice and research. In addition to the hard skills required to fill urban knowledge and data gaps, skills development for social relevance must access different teaching and learning cultures, mindsets, and approaches from those within and outside the university. Identifying the range of soft skills needed for effective partnership building is more challenging to identify and integrate into curricula. The UN Education for Sustainable Development Initiative recognizes the significance of values and attitudes to enable more just and sustainable society for all. In bringing relevant curricula and pedagogies to support urban transformations, questions that need to be engaged include what is it that students need to know, learn, and practice in order to build the new African urban university? How is this delivered and by whom? What does transdisciplinary engagement mean for teaching-led research and for research-led teaching? So lastly, reflecting on the LIRA program and reflections from working with early career scholars across Africa. Whilst engaged research is no longer new, it remains novel in sustainability research. It is gaining popularity in funding calls. However, there's very little evidence-based reflection on what it takes to do engaged research in a landscape that is constructed to support disciplinary research. Similarly, there's little reflection on the institutional requirements of allowing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and systems to flourish. In my final minutes, I just want to take I just want to reflect a little bit on the LIRA program, which showed that the context within which socially engaged research occurs challenges numerous assumptions about research, including who does research, where research is conducted, how outputs are valued, and how research is supported. So the first deviation from disciplinary research lies in who conducts research. So in engaged research, the academic researcher is not given the pole position. The objective is to ensure partnerships of equivalence in the research process with all knowledge types being valued. Engaging diverse knowledge communities ranging from civil society to policy communities, both locally and globally, and the private sector. These communities don't have equal access to power structures, so require different points of entry and forms of engagement. The competencies required to make these reflective adjustments are not currently captured or taught. Similarly, the building of trust, the nurturing of relationships are key to the success of these partnerships. Again, building these competencies and landing them in state curricula is challenging. The second digression from disciplinary research and the way in which universities are traditionally structured lies in the sites of research. And I think Neha spoke about this as well. The laboratory for engaged scholarship has numerous guises, and the metaphorical table around which diverse researchers come together has varying shapes and forms. So similarly, engaged teaching flips assumptions about who lectures, where, and on what. Including a range of expertise implies that research and teaching is situated where partners are. Working in this way requires an unlearning of the disciplinary practices with their clear separation between subject and object. The roles and responsibilities of partners changes, and the academic must have skills in managing teams and expectations. How research emerging from engaged partnerships beyond the university is valued is the third area that requires reconfiguration. Engagements aimed at improving societal benefits is value-based and relational, requiring much care and investment in relationships, which is unaccounted for labor. The significance and relevance of the academic paper for research partners is not always shared, necessitating the production of a range of other knowledge products or boundary objects around which relevance for partners can cohere, including, for example, policy briefs, comics, documentaries, op-eds, zines, amongst others. In this context, emphasis on narrow measures based on academic outputs are misplaced. Research for societal benefit requires a much wider range of metrics to assess the relevance and value of partnerships, learnings, and its outcomes and outputs. Similarly, projects need to be appropriately resourced to produce a range of knowledge products, and researchers need to be supported to develop appropriate skills. And finally, attribution and impact are challenging in areas in scholarship that extends beyond the university. Effective partnerships are often based on long-term relationships and salience of issues being focused on. Prior knowledge, personalities, and persuasion of researchers are of significance, but difficult to account for in our present systems. For projects to be effective, they are often also required to meet global, national, local, and programmatic objectives, as well as the needs of knowledge partners and funders. This is a tall order. Given that relevance means very different things to different partners and at different scales, assessing effectiveness is a moving target. So in closing, for universities to advance the achievement of just and sustainable futures, we must necessarily work across institutional and disciplinary cultures, and this requires changes at both the strategic level, but also at the level of systems. These changes won't happen automatically. Transgressing the established system needs to be planned and executed in deliberate ways within universities, but also through advocacy and action to shift the global political economy of knowledge production, which entrenches patterns of imbalance and reinforces some of the constraints faced by universities. Thank you. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Zarina. Thank you for such a considered and comprehensive input, and also for sharing all the insights from this project on the new African Urban University. I hope I have the right wording. And thank you also for, well, first of all, this network reflection, which I think is really important to the work that we're trying to do together. We need to think together about these issues, and we can only bring about change in a more networked, through a more networked approach. Thanks also for all the inputs, thinking across education, research, and public engagement. It's interesting actually that we all have different words to talk about public engagement across all our different universities. So we have now a lot of fantastic questions and remarks, and I'm going to try and attempt to bring some of them together. My apologies for the audience if I don't raise your questions, and we will find a way of continuing this conversation. One of the first set of questions I saw coming from Sam Hickey, and I think can connect with Francesca Conetti's questions, and possibly also Olofin Olabode Phillips' question, has to do with, in a way, the tension between very interesting, innovative, public-spirited, almost activist responses and pilots, and how they are managing to be activated, maintained, supported in a context of increasingly marketized universities. So there's almost a series of questions on tips of how to deal with that, how to also potentially scale up some of these very exciting pilots. I saw another set of questions regarding the public role of the university and what that might mean. And some were asking whether it had to do with the protection of pushing certain ideas that one cannot push in other contexts. Another one from Adriana in the chat, Adriana Allen, was around, sorry, I'm now trying to go up, whether that public role has to do with a critical steward, the university being a critical steward and broker of knowledge production, circulation and application as commons. Again, then asking this question, coming back to the first one, is how does one deal with that in a political economy of higher education, which is not necessarily conducive to this. There's also another way of looking at this, public role coming from Sri Lanka, Priyanvada from Moratua University, asking whether social entrepreneurship and building these skills could be seen as a way of defining that public role. Yes, and then questions about levers for doing things differently. And then another question, which is interesting, around synergies between institutions. How can universities, here in this instance, it was private and public universities, but I'd like to encourage you to think maybe about this networked approach or this ecology of knowledge production that many of you have raised today. So there's a lot of questions here. My apologies if I haven't picked up on all of them now. Can I ask all of you to pick on the questions that you seem most more of interest to you? And I know there's a lot, so just pick and choose. We only have a quarter of an hour, unfortunately. Can I ask Neha perhaps to start?
Sure, happy to. And like you said, thank you all in the audience for all of these very, very interesting and sort of thought-provoking questions. And, you know, I'm sure we'll continue the debate later. It's a lot to sort of pick up on. I think there are a couple of things that I think I would like to talk about. One is, I think, this idea of the university as a broker in some ways, of being able to do this. And I think that, of course, you know, and sort of the currency of knowledge in some ways, and how that circulates. And I think that I would go back to the idea of this larger ecosystem in some ways, where a lot of the means and modes of knowledge circulation are predefined, and they're kind of, you know, embedded within other larger ways of thinking about it. I'm thinking particularly about publishers and sort of journals that act as gatekeepers in a lot of ways to the circulation of knowledge. And I think that is actually a really kind of, you know, critical thing that I feel like as universities, we need to work towards kind of opening up that space a little bit more, because particularly coming from institutions in the global south, access to knowledge, I think, becomes really, really challenging. And it becomes it's kind of a chicken and egg question in some ways, where, you know, you want to participate in international you know, spaces, you want to participate in these networks, you want to have access to funding, for example, and in order to be able to do that, you have to be visible in certain spheres of knowledge. And I think that the ability for institutions across the world not to be visible in those spaces becomes a challenge in some ways. And I think that there's also a role that we have, and as researchers and as people who work in knowledge institutions, have a responsibility to you know, in some ways, the subjects of our research and the subjects of, you know, the people that we teach with, and you know, with people in our classrooms, and the ability of us to not be able to share the knowledge that we have with the people that we've sort of drawn on to create that knowledge, I think becomes a bit of a tension. And so I think the idea of the university as a broker is actually a really interesting one, because how much, I mean, it ends up being a matter of choice within the university to some extent, about to what extent people want to engage, the institution itself wants to engage with these larger kind of practices of knowledge circulation. But to another, you know, to the other end, if you want to be able to continue to do the work that you want to do, it's really, really difficult to not participate in some ways. You're on mute.
Sorry, I wasn't on. Yes, I just wanted to thank you, Neha, for these additional points. There's constantly more coming to the pot. Mona, please, would you like to just respond in the little time we have? Thank you.
Yes, I'll try to take one question and reflect on it, perhaps the one by Hannah on decolonization. I know it's a big deal in the UK, and I don't think it's a big deal where I come from, but I think it's interesting to also reflect on that, because perhaps also colleagues have that situation, because we've been often solicited to act as partners on a number of funding proposals as being situated in the Global South, because this is becoming more and more of a requirement, I think, to raise points on proposal when one is fundraising for research. And as Neha was just saying, this is quite challenging, because on one hand, you want that because it gives visibility to what you're doing, opportunities to students and researchers you're working with. The university will be quite happy to receive some funds, but at the same time, it's not always on agendas. You are co-defining with the authors of these proposals. You're often dealt with as the local partner, providing native knowledge to people where you speak the language, they don't, and so you become almost as an RA to the big scholars in the first world universities. So it's not as equal as it wants to be. And I think at some point we've come to a conclusion that these are not very interesting setups for us, where we are much more asked to, I mean, we're putting much more than we're receiving in terms of even intellectual input. In terms of funding, it's not really interesting, and intellectually we're often geared towards research agendas we haven't defined. And I think this also tells us about how Western scholarship needs to account more to realities on the ground. I think we've heard a lot about this, and I find it very important. I mean, I'm in a classroom where my students don't have access to internet, to electricity, are struggling to pay for the bus bringing them to the university, even if the university gives them a scholarship. And when students are burdened with such issues, your role in that classroom becomes so specific, and I feel it's often very alien to people sitting in first world universities and concerned with other priorities. So I feel there's a disconnect somewhere between the global north and global south, and sometimes I find it much easier to work with the global south universities, where the issues I'm talking about echoes with other issues, and the intersections are stronger. I've been a part of the Arab Council for Social Sciences, and as an institution that's promoting social sciences between the global south, I found that these networks were much more productive for scholars engaged in them, and it tells us something about these partnerships. So I think it's a very good question to reflect on, and to also think, how can we reduce this disconnect and make these partnerships much more agile and adapted to contexts that have very different circumstances.
Thank you very much for this. And I'm sorry I had missed that question. It's a really important one. Of course, thinking about the public role of the university is local, but also global. And within that, we need to engage with these unequal power relations, and we need to look at them very seriously. There's a lot of work to be done. And it's certainly something that we will be continuing in our conversation. A few last words from Francisco, and then Zarina.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. The debate is really interesting. It's very broadly as well, so which is not easy, but I'm trying to reflect a bit here. I think that we still have an important task, which is to better define our role, or our roles in plural. We should think. In a so complex society, with so many crises we are facing, and I'm struck by how the academics from the same university, my university, for instance, have such different views and actions in the quotidianos. So each professor is a kind of a star in a constellation, is incredible. And so I think it's not easy. At the same time, for instance, when we are in a community, in many circumstances, we have almost always to explain what is the university, what is the role of the university, explain that the university is not the city hall, it's not the court, it's not an NGO, because for the communities, many times the university is something so distant, because in Brazil, it's a kind of a space so privileged, historically space, and many times we have to explain for the popular communities which is the university, which is a public university, or which kind of things we can do here with them, we can build together, and how and what they can expect from us, and what they don't have to expect from us. I think this is really challenging, and lately we have been reflecting to what extent the university itself and also its public role is under attack and at the same time under dispute. So there is a dispute of narrative, it's a dispute of the roles, it's a dispute of the kind of space in the society which the public universities could occupy. So another thing, the last comment I would like to do is I was thinking about how can we build universities that can better be known and legitimatized by the society in a more general way. So, for instance, the society, many times the society don't understand the role of public university. Many times, for instance, in times of strikes, for instance, or cuts in funding by governments, sometimes that it is happening at this moment in Brazil. These are issues that are very important. How to legitimize universities more, make them less elite, and so that the population as a whole engages in their defenses. And so we think that engaged in extension work has been seen as one of the ways to build such legitimations. But the number of academics that are engaged is still small, and the attacks are diverse. I think we should reflect many more, but the time, I think the time is over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francisco. Zarina, just 1 minute. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'll take 30 seconds. I spoke quite a long time when I did my presentation. I just want to pick up on this question about shifting the political economy of knowledge production. And I think that, you know, this is a role that each and every one of us needs to play as academic activists in our roles as sitting on editorial boards, sitting on foundations, sitting on trusts. I think that how we shape and how we speak back to funders, I think that these are really, really important roles that we have to play as individual researchers to make sure that we're not complicit in this agenda that makes things more difficult, but rather to push back and to raise awareness where we can. So I'll leave it at that, but I put the responsibility in all our hands.
Thanks very much, Zarina, for this reminder. And I'm sorry we have to close this conversation, which has been extremely rich and thought-provoking and clearly needs to continue. I'd like to thank very much our wonderful panelists for their very rich and incisive presentations, also for the thought-provoking questions from everyone in the audience. Yes, the conversation will continue, and it needs to continue, as everybody mentioned, in an individual but also very much collective, networked and global fashion at very many scales, in the various different areas in which we work as academics. So thanks again for that. Just a quick word in the chat to let you know that we will be sharing this recording on the DSA website. And also to invite you to attend the DSA conference, which will be starting in July. And please continue sending your questions to myself. I'll put them in the chat so that we can continue this conversation. There is a process in play, but it will be fantastic to hear from all of you. Thank you so much again. Goodbye. Chat. So.
Thanks, everybody.